An airport security officer tried to intimidate a black father holding his baby, but he had no idea the man was a Delta Force-trained operative. An airport security officer beat a black father while he was holding his baby. Believing the man would break under fear, he didn't realize the father was a Delta Force-trained operative who had ended far worse threats than him. The moment that baton lifted, the entire terminal's fate changed. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when true power rises. The scanner let out a high-pitched chirp, an error tone. Officer Brent Korr's boots were already in motion. He stepped forward from the wall where he had been watching, his hand resting near his utility belt. The man in front of the scanner stood tall, broad shoulders, calm eyes, a baby swaddled in soft blue fabric cradled against his chest. He hadn't flinched when the machine glitched, nor did he look confused. Just patient. Too patient, Brent thought. "Step aside, sir," Brent barked, cutting past the nervous gate agent. His tone was unnecessarily loud for the modest crowd gathered near Gate 42B. The man turned his head slightly, careful not to disturb the sleeping child in his arms. His voice was calm, deliberate. "The boarding scanner just misread the code," he said. The gate agent offered to manually check it. Brent didn't care. He didn't like the way this man held his ground. Something about him, the way he didn't rush to explain, the absence of nervous gestures, read as defiance to Brent. He hated that. Authority, he believed, was only as strong as its enforcement. "That's not your call to make," Brent replied, stepping closer, face now inches away. "I'll be the one to decide how we handle misreads." The man nodded slowly, his left hand shifting slightly to support the baby's head. "Understood. My name is Major Dorian Rell. I'm just trying to get through like everyone else." Brent's eyes narrowed. "Major? Military?" "I'm retired, civilian status now, traveling with my son." The gate agent, a young man with thinning hair and too much cologne, cleared his throat timidly. "I can verify the pass manually, officer. The system just—" Brent cut him off with a dismissive wave. "You can sit down. I said I've got this." Passengers nearby were starting to notice. A mother holding her toddler leaned sideways to whisper something to her husband. A man in a business suit slowed down to listen, phone slightly tilted as if preparing to record. Dorian felt the shift in atmosphere. He didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. His right hand remained steady, keeping the baby nestled safely against his shoulder. The child stirred faintly, tiny fingers curling against the fabric of his father's shirt. "There's no need for this to escalate," Dorian said softly. "The agent can verify the boarding pass. No harm done." But Brent wasn't listening. He was watching the way Dorian held himself, too relaxed, too confident. It triggered something in him. Years of nursing invisible slights, of losing arguments in break rooms, of watching men like Dorian walk into rooms and command quiet respect without demanding it. Brent had spent a career compensating, and here was a man who didn't need to. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Brent said, voice rising slightly. His hand drifted toward his belt radio. The message was unspoken, but clear. "I can call backup. I can make this something." Dorian's eyes remained calm, but his jaw tightened. "I have a baby in my arms," he said. "Let's not make this about pride." Brent's lips curled. He took a half-step forward, chest puffed as if squaring off. "Then stop acting like you're above the rules." Without warning, Officer Brent Korr drove both hands into Dorian Rell's chest, slamming him back into the metal paneling beside the boarding tunnel. The impact echoed with a dull metallic thud. Dorian twisted just in time so that his left shoulder absorbed the brunt of the force instead of the fragile bundle he cradled against his chest. His son's startled wail pierced the terminal's buzz like shattering glass. Dorian dropped to one knee instinctively, sheltering the infant in the cradle of his arms, his back now to the wall. Pain flared along his shoulder blade, but his eyes never left Brent. They locked, calm but sharp, assessing the next move. Not as a threat, but as a man trained to end threats in a single breath if he had to. But this wasn't war. It was a boarding gate, and his child was crying. "I'm holding my son," Dorian said slowly, voice low and even, as he used his body to shield the boy from the stairs, the noise, the sudden chaos. Brent's hand flew to his radio. "I've got a non-compliant male, Section C, refusing commands. Backup requested," he barked, voice loud enough to attract attention from half the concourse. A few passengers froze. Some instinctively stepped back, but others leaned in, confusion in their eyes. "Sir, he didn't do anything," one man called from the line. A younger man near the vending machine raised his phone and started recording, the red light blinking like a quiet alarm. Another dashed toward the nearby information desk, mouthing, "Get help." Still kneeling, Dorian gently shifted his grip on the baby, checking that the swaddling hadn't loosened, his hand cradling the back of the small head. The child's cries had softened to gasps and hiccups, the frightened breathing of someone too small to understand violence. Two more uniformed security officers approached briskly, their gait unsure, eyes bouncing between Brent and the kneeling man. Brent didn't wait. He pointed an accusatory finger as if Dorian had just tried to breach a restricted area. "Put the child down and stand up now," he shouted. Dorian raised his head slowly. His face was composed, but there was iron behind his eyes. "You want to escalate this," he said, "in front of a dozen cameras?" There was no threat in his tone, only clarity, a reminder, a choice. Brent hesitated, barely a flicker, but then his jaw clenched. He stepped forward, breath shallow, skin flushed. Whether it was ego, fear, or something older and uglier, it pushed him past reason. With a grunt, Brent lunged and grabbed Dorian's free arm. The grip was wrong, too high on the elbow, and Dorian instantly knew this man had no idea how to handle physical restraint properly. Brent wrenched the arm backward in a crude attempt at compliance. The child screamed again, the kind of sound that made bystanders wince. Dorian winced too, not from pain, but from the weight of restraint. Every nerve in his body knew how to reverse the hold, how to counter, how to put the man flat on the tile floor in under 3 seconds without letting go of the baby. But none of those options would help his son stop crying. He remained where he was, back tense, neck angled, breathing sharp through his nose. Not because he couldn't fight, but because he was fighting harder than anyone could see. "Stop!" someone yelled. "He's got a baby." Another voice, older, trembled with fury. "This is wrong. He didn't do anything." Brent raised his voice above the crowd, his tone wild now. "Step back, all of you. This is a safety situation." A safety situation. The words rang hollow. Dorian, still partially twisted with his arm bent behind him, turned his head just enough to speak. "You're going to regret this decision," he said quietly. His eyes didn't plead, they warned. Brent leaned in, sweat beading under his brow. "You think you're special because you've got a kid and a deep voice?" he hissed, trying to assert dominance, trying to restore control that had already slipped beyond him. Dorian looked at him fully then. The baby now rested more securely in his arm, and even though his own shoulder throbbed from the earlier impact, his spine stayed straight. "No," he said, voice steady. "I'm special because I trained men who taught your instructors." Dorian sat motionless in the sterile, dimly lit security room, the fluorescent lights above flickering faintly like the tension in the air. His left arm throbbed with a dull ache where Brent had twisted it. The bruise was forming fast, darkening beneath his sleeve, but his grip around his baby remained steady, protective. The child squirmed slightly in his lap, soothed only by the rhythmic pat of his father's hand against his back. Across the room, Officer Brent Korr paced like a caged animal. His jaw was tight, his breaths shallow, his posture overinflated with authority he no longer fully possessed. He muttered under his breath, half rehearsing, half venting. He needed a story, fast, a clean version, one that made him the peacekeeper, not the aggressor, one that justified what he'd done in front of all those passengers. The door creaked open. Corvin Vale entered, tall and wiry with thinning hair and a face that wore the weight of middle management. He paused upon entry, his eyes bouncing from Brent's restless motion to Dorian's composed stillness. "What's going on here?" he asked sharply, closing the door behind him. Brent turned, ready. "Non-compliance. Passenger refused to cooperate, got aggressive. I had to intervene before it escalated." Dorian said nothing. He didn't even raise his eyes. Instead, his thumb quietly tapped a hidden prompt on the phone in his pocket, a preset action created years ago during his service: upload encrypted copy to secured cloud. A tiny vibration confirmed the upload had begun. Corvin frowned. Escalated. With an infant in his arms? Brent's jaw clenched. He was evasive. The boarding pass glitched. Wouldn't follow instructions. He was holding a baby, Corvin said again, the doubt creeping into his tone now. He glanced at Dorian, who remained still, calm, alert. Then a subtle moment shifted the room. A junior officer, Halden Marr, stood near the wall, arms folded. He'd been quiet until now, but his eyes locked on something beneath Dorian's jacket, just barely visible from where the collar had slipped down during the scuffle. It was small, embroidered, and unmistakable. His throat tightened. "Sir." Halden stepped forward slowly, eyes now wide with realization. "Do you have any military credentials we should know about?" Brent scoffed behind him. "Oh, come on. What's that got to do with anything?" But Dorian finally looked up, meeting Halden's gaze. There was no anger in his eyes, just weight. "I held Tier 1 clearance," he said quietly. "Check the database. Unit Valkyrin." The name dropped into the air like a steel anchor. For a second, no one moved. Halden blinked, lips parting slightly as if to ask something else, but he stopped. He knew the name. Valkyrin wasn't standard infantry. It wasn't even public knowledge to most. It was whispered about in classified briefings, teams used in Black Zone rescues, extractions from war zones that officially didn't exist. You didn't check Valkyrin records unless you had clearance layered in titanium. Corvin Vale, suddenly pale, nodded and stepped out of the room without a word. The door clicked shut behind him. Brent looked confused. "What? What's Valkyrin?" Halden didn't answer. He stared at Dorian now with an entirely different posture, upright, respectful, uncertain. Outside, Corvin pulled out his personal phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in nearly a decade. Each ring tightened his gut. On the third ring, someone answered. "This is Supervisor Vale from Varnell. We have a situation." The voice on the other end replied calmly. "Name?" "Major Dorian Rell." There was a pause, then, "Stay where you are. Do not detain. Do not delay. You'll be contacted momentarily." Corvin didn't hang up. He just lowered the phone and stared ahead, knowing what it meant. A flag. Not a criminal record. Something higher. Something that didn't sit in public law enforcement databases, but in sealed oversight divisions reserved for men whose assignments could never be named in court. Men trained not just in combat, but in containment, de-escalation, survival in high-risk urban zones, including airports, the very scenario Brent had just fumbled into. Back inside, the silence had grown heavy. Brent broke it. "You think dropping some spooky military name is going to scare me?" Dorian didn't reply. He adjusted his child's blanket gently, keeping the boy's head tucked near his chest. Brent scoffed again, pacing faster now, sweat building under his collar. Suddenly, the door burst open. A young security tech stepped inside, eyes darting. He crossed straight to Corvin, who had just returned, leaned in, and whispered something in his ear. Everyone watched as Corvin's face drained further. He turned slowly toward Brent, voice even but strained. The name Major Rell just triggered a Department of Aviation oversight flag. "A flag?" Brent blinked. "Restricted," Corvin said. "Separate server, not accessible by standard airport clearance." Brent opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Korvin looked at Dorian, who met his eyes with quiet precision. The message was clear now. Brent hadn't just mishandled a situation. He had touched someone who operated above the protocols Brent thought he knew. Dorian didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He just cradled his son and offered one final sentence, voice cool and direct. "You shouldn't have touched him." The tension inside the security room was dense, like static in the air before a storm. Officer Brent Korr paced tightly near the wall, jaw clenched, his fingers twitching near his holster though the situation no longer demanded force. On the opposite side of the room, Dorian Rell sat motionless in a rigid metal chair, his injured arm resting carefully across his lap while the other cradled his baby's tiny body. The child's cries had quieted into hiccuping whimpers, soothed by his father's steady heartbeat. But Dorian's calm wasn't passivity. It was precision. He was watching, calculating, waiting for the gears outside the room to catch up with the mistake Brent had just made. Outside, those gears were already grinding. Unbeknownst to Brent or even the security supervisor Corvin Vale, an automated alert had already been triggered. As soon as Dorian had tapped the upload command on his secured device, a protocol embedded in an app co-developed by his former unit, an encrypted signal pinged a dormant list in a federal database. The label attached to that ping: Tier 1 Dependent Compromise. Flag red. In a quiet monitoring room within the Terminal Rights Division's regional headquarters, a federal analyst named Merrick Dorn watched his terminal flash crimson. His eyes widened. "Valkyrie protocol just activated," he muttered, lifting the phone. "We have a flag at Varnell. Tier 1 operative with a minor involved. Possible misconduct on site." Back in the security room, Brent's voice broke the silence again. He was uncooperative from the beginning, Brent insisted, speaking more to the walls than to anyone listening. Tried to walk past the scanner without clearance. He had an attitude. Didn't respond to orders. His words trembled at the edges, thinly coated with confidence but bleeding defensiveness underneath. Dorian said nothing at first. He simply shifted the blanket over his son's back and let the silence deepen. Only when Brent turned to face him directly did he finally speak. "You're trying to rewrite it before it's written," Dorian said softly, his voice even but firm. "But it's already out there." Brent blinked. "What?" Dorian didn't answer. He didn't need to. Outside the terminal, a passenger named Karen Vale, coincidentally Corvin's estranged cousin, was uploading the video he had recorded from Gate 14. The footage captured every moment: the shove, the infant's cry, Brent twisting Dorian's arm while the baby screamed. Karen didn't include commentary, just one caption: "Black father attacked while holding baby. No cause." By the time Corvin's phone rang, the video had already passed 20,000 views. Corvin Vale, who had just returned from the lower concourse, saw the caller ID and froze. His brow furrowed. He hadn't heard this name in over a decade. He stepped into the hallway before answering. "Rylan," he said, cautious. "Corvin," replied a low voice, direct and controlled. "I just received a cross-channel ping. You're holding a Tier 1 veteran with a dependent child. There better be a good explanation." Corvin's heart skipped. He looked through the small glass pane into the security room. It escalated before I arrived. There was a misunderstanding." "No," Rylan Marin interrupted, his voice sharpening like a knife being drawn. "There was a breakdown. You need to listen very carefully. You release him now, document the sequence exactly as it occurred, and prepare a full report. Or you'll be preparing it from the other side of a civil suit." Corvin opened his mouth, then closed it. He knew that tone. Years ago, Rylan had led investigations into incidents that destroyed entire departments. Corvin returned to the room visibly rattled. Inside, Brent was still pacing, muttering half-finished arguments to himself. Protocol this, standard that. He wasn't even showing identification. For all we know, he's not who he says he is. Dorian finally looked up at him, not with anger, but with clinical detachment, like a surgeon observing a flawed procedure. "This was never about procedure," Dorian said. His voice was quiet, but it struck like a tuning fork against metal. "This was about power." Brent turned sharply, his face twisted, his words laced with scorn. "You think you'll walk out of here like a hero?" Dorian didn't flinch. He rose slowly, his child still in his arms, his posture straight and deliberate. For a moment, it was as if time stalled, the fluorescent lights above humming like an anxious breath. "I don't need to walk out a hero," he said, his eyes locked on Brent's with the clarity of a mirror. "I just needed you to reveal yourself." "Sir, you're being placed on administrative hold." The words dropped like a hammer, silencing the corridor outside the internal affairs room. Brent Korr, still flushed with frustration, paused mid-step as two senior officials flanked Major Dorian Rell, escorting him calmly through the terminal's restricted corridor. Brent blinked, dumbfounded, his jaw tightening. "For what?" he barked, arms raised in disbelief. He resisted. He led investigator, a square-shouldered man named Selric Dane, didn't blink. His voice was ice. "For violating protocol while handling a protected status passenger with a dependent, and for physical assault, captured on 3 angles." Brent's mouth opened, then closed again as the nearby monitor screens flickered to life, playing silent loops of his shove, his grip, and Dorian's unwavering composure with his child still in his arms. The imagery wasn't violent in the way Brent expected. It was worse. It was clear, measured, undeniable. Every frame told the same story. A man attacked for remaining calm. Dorian said nothing as he moved past Brent. His arms still wrapped gently around his son. He didn't look back, didn't speak, didn't gloat. His steps were slow but grounded, like someone who had nothing left to prove. The child, now sleeping again, nestled under his chin, unaware of the storm his presence had helped expose. Outside the terminal, the air was already buzzing. A wave of flashing cameras lined the outer security perimeter, journalists elbowing for position. Microphones jutted out from behind ropes. One reporter shouted, "Major Rell, do you have any comment on the altercation?" Another yelled, "Is it true the officer targeted you because of race?" Dorian's expression didn't change. He pulled the corner of the baby's blanket slightly upward, shielding the child's face from the glare. He offered no soundbite, no dramatic gesture, only the image of a man choosing silence over spectacle. Behind the tinted windows of a waiting town car, the doors were held open by one of the internal affairs escorts. Dorian stepped inside, gently cradling his son. As the vehicle pulled away, Brent stood at the terminal doors, breathing heavily, still in uniform but now separated from purpose. Selric turned to him, clipboard in hand. "I'll need your badge and access card. We'll notify you when your hearing is scheduled." Brent's shoulders slumped. "This is a mistake," he muttered, though it sounded like he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. At home, later that evening, the quiet was jarring. Dorian sat on the edge of his couch, the TV flickering softly across the dimly lit room. His son, now freshly bathed and swaddled, cooed in a bassinet beside him. News anchors rotated in and out of frame, all playing the same now viral footage, a loop of Brent's shove, a close-up of Dorian's firm, unshaken voice, the baby's cry. Then, the moment Brent twisted Dorian's arm. Each frame analyzed, reanalyzed, slowed down for emphasis. The screen split to panels of legal experts and retired military officials dissecting every second. One commentator said, "This isn't just a story about abuse of power. It's a story about restraint in the face of it." Dorian muted the television. In the silence, he rose and walked to the kitchen. He prepared a bottle, tested it on his wrist, then returned to the bassinet. He lifted his son and sat down slowly, feeding him while the soft hum of late-night commentary continued behind closed captions. His fingers moved gently across the baby's back in small circles, calming them both. A newscaster appeared on screen, mistakenly referring to Dorian as just a father caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Dorian's eyes didn't leave the screen, but something in them sharpened. A flicker, not of anger, but of knowing. A quiet kind of fire. He leaned slightly forward, gaze steady, and whispered under his breath, not to the news, not to the world, but to something deeper. No, I was the test they failed. The footage had only been online for 48 hours, but it was already everywhere. From legal analysts dissecting the body language of Officer Brent Korr frame by frame, to veteran networks pausing on Dorian's grip on his son, and civil rights boards debating protocols, the reaction was swift and cutting. On national television, the most replayed segment came from Camera 2. The moment Brent initiated the shove, and Dorian, instead of retaliating, crouched and shielded his infant son with both arms as his back hit the wall. No words, just instinct and control. At a Veteran Affairs office in Maryland, a man named Marcus Veyron leaned forward in his chair, arms folded tightly. He had watched the clip 3 times in silence. The lights in his office remained dim. Marcus was a senior handler at Sentinel Strat Command, a private federal-adjacent agency tasked with monitoring Tier 1 veterans during their reintegration into civilian life. But more than that, he had once bled alongside Dorian in the Valkyrie program. They trained in close-quarters restraint drills, hostage extractions, and psychological deterrence. He knew what Dorian was capable of. And watching that footage, Marcus didn't see a man frozen in fear. He saw a man calibrating restraint at a level few civilians could comprehend. He picked up the secure phone on his desk and dialed a direct line to the Civil Aviation Tribunal. "This isn't just about a wrongful assault," Marcus said, voice firm. "That officer jeopardized the life of a dependent under federal protection. We're flagging the incident for tier review, level 6. A pause, then the response came low and urgent. "Understood. Send the file through encrypted stream. We'll escalate." Meanwhile, Brent Korr wasn't hiding. Against the advice of his union representative, who had pleaded with him to remain silent while an internal review played out, Brent scheduled a segment on a local TV station. Seated under harsh studio lighting, wearing a clipped blue tie and a too-tight expression, he looked into the camera and spoke carefully, as if choosing the words he thought would gain him sympathy. The man looked threatening. "I had to follow procedure," he said, shrugging once. Back at Varnell Terminal, the damage ignited like dry timber. Brent's choice of phrasing was instantly recognized for what it was, a dog whistle coded in uniform. The phrase, "looked threatening," trended within the hour. News anchors repeated it with raised brows. Analysts called it a relic of racial profiling. But the people didn't wait for the verdict. Protesters gathered at the entrance of Varnell Terminal by sundown. They came in waves, young fathers carrying babies, veterans with their medals displayed, college students holding cardboard signs. Their expressions were solemn, steady, but not angry. The signs spoke for them. Fathers aren't threats. Racism is. You profiled a protector. Delta doesn't fold. And towering above them all, painted in bold black letters on white canvas, the sign that would become the image syndicated across newspapers the next morning. "He trained Delta Force. You couldn't handle a stroller." The memo arrived in a sealed gray envelope stamped with the insignia of Sentinel Strat Command, a rarely seen symbol inside civilian terminals. It was hand-delivered to the office of the Internal Review Committee chair at Varnell International, who opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a one-page summary and a single, classified attachment. The summary reviewed Major Dorian Rell's military service, clearance level, and current civilian designation. But it was the attachment that froze the committee in stunned silence. It described a covert training assignment from a decade ago, codenamed Op Cascade Calm. The mission, hostage extractions in crowded public spaces, locations like malls, stadiums, airports. The wording was dry, technical. But the implication roared. Dorian Rell wasn't just a decorated veteran. He had been trained to remain calm while hunted, specifically in airports. And now, here he was on camera, not returning a blow, not raising his voice, holding a child while being manhandled by an officer who hadn't even checked his ID. The irony was unbearable. One of the committee members, an older man named Darren Kess, stared at the footage on his screen and muttered, "We disciplined the textbook instead of reading it." While that realization swept through the upper floors, a second tremor rocked the lower levels of the airport security wing. A junior officer, thin, pale, with shaking hands, stepped forward to speak with an internal affairs representative. His name was Officer Taryn Voss, and he had served under Brent Korr for 2 years. What he said cracked the dam wide open. "Brent has a pattern," Taryn began, eyes darting toward the surveillance camera. "He targets black passengers, especially the ones who don't act intimidated. He says they test the perimeter. His words, he keeps a list." The internal affairs officer blinked. "A list?" Taryn nodded. "Incidents, escalations, but he buries them in wording, like calling someone non-compliant when they just asked a question." That was enough to warrant a search. When they pulled Brent's complaint log, the patterns emerged. 5 prior complaints, all involving black male passengers. None had gone public. All had been filed under internal noise codes, verbal misalignment, gate delay complication, and the eerily vague procedural oversight. By the time the Civil Aviation Tribune convened for a public briefing, the case had ballooned into something far larger than a single assault. It had become a test of institutional awareness. Seated at the center of the long tribunal table was Dr. Lennox Harvin, a sharp-eyed man with a firm jaw and a no-nonsense demeanor. Cameras lined the edges of the press room, their red lights blinking like warnings. Dr. Harvin adjusted the microphone, glanced at the sealed packet in front of him, and began. "Today, we are not here to only discipline an individual," he said, his voice measured, resonating with quiet authority. "We are here to examine a system that confused arrogance with enforcement and punished calm as defiance." He paused, letting the silence stretch, pulling every eye toward him. He then held up a printed still frame from the footage. Dorian, kneeling, child in one arm, other arm twisted behind him, expression controlled. "This image," Dr. Harvin said slowly, "is not just evidence. It is irony. This man was trained, at our own federal expense, to remain calm in the most volatile civilian environments. And what did we do? We provoked him. We cornered him. And we recorded our failure." Reporters scribbled. Some gasped softly. Brent, watching from a private holding room, clenched his jaw, but it was the final moment of the briefing that sealed the narrative's shift. "Calm under fire," Dr. Harvin continued, "should be honored, not punished." His tone hardened, especially when the fire was unjustified in the first place. The officer smirked, certain his badge would shield him, unaware that every strike he threw was being measured, timed, and calculated by someone who had spent years mastering combat at the highest level. If you believe cruelty under authority always folds when discipline meets elite training, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The courtroom was silent as Dorian Rell entered through the side doors of the Aviation Oversight Panel's hearing chamber, his footsteps steady, his infant son cradled gently against his chest. The room wasn't packed like a criminal trial, but it carried more weight. This was federal. Civil, yes, but the kind of civil hearing that had the power to rewrite policy across the country. As he stepped to the witness table, Dorian adjusted the soft blue blanket in his son's arms and placed it gently on the polished oak surface. No fanfare, no grand gestures, just the quiet precision of a man who had operated behind enemy lines and who now carried a different kind of mission. A clerk motioned for him to raise his right hand, but the tribunal chair, Dr. Lennox Harvin, interjected before he could. "Mr. Rell, you may remain seated while holding the child. We'll administer affirmation differently." Dorian nodded once in acknowledgement. The questioning began calmly. A panelist leaned forward, voice measured. "Mr. Rell, during the altercation at Varnell Terminal, you made no physical counter-response. Why?" Dorian's answer was simple but cut through the tension like glass. "Because I knew the cameras were rolling. But more importantly, my son was watching." A pause rippled across the room, followed by audible reactions. A few leaned back, others scribbled notes. The reporter from the Aviation Tribune adjusted his glasses and mouthed the word, "Wow." Dorian continued, his voice steady. "That's the kind of force I'm trained to use. Discipline." It wasn't a boast, it was a principle, stated plainly. But the weight of it struck the room like a command. The tribunal shifted to the next question. "How would you describe Officer Brent Korr's actions during the incident?" Dorian didn't flinch. He didn't use adjectives. The uniform should never hide a grudge. The silence afterward said more than any follow-up could. No accusation, no insult, just a clean dissection of power misused. Then came the reveal, an unexpected twist delivered not with drama, but with cold efficiency. A cybersecurity expert from the Oversight Board walked to the center podium with a digital pointer. He clicked once, and a sequence of time-stamped entries appeared on the monitor behind him. The incident report Officer Korr submitted was altered after the video recording was captured, the expert announced. The original file was delayed in being uploaded. Metadata confirmed that key timestamps were shifted and wording was revised. We ran AI analysis against the draft version and the final upload. There's a 37% discrepancy rate. Brent's lawyer immediately objected. "Objection. Contextual editing isn't illegal." Dr. Harvin looked over his glasses. "It is, when it obstructs an ethics review tied to the Federal Terminal Code. Objection noted. Overruled." Brent shifted in his chair. His jaw clenched. His lawyer leaned in, whispering rapidly, but Brent kept staring ahead, unmoving. Outside the chamber, word of the obstruction charge was already spreading. But inside, the weight of Dorian's restraint continued to eclipse Brent's spiraling defense. Panelist Ron Marston asked the next question. "Mr. Rell, in hindsight, do you believe you were targeted for any specific reason?" Dorian's eyes locked on the questioner. "I believe the reason didn't start with me, but it ended with me." Then came the character affidavits. Dozens of sealed letters had been submitted by officers, commanders, and mission leads who had worked with Dorian across multiple deployments. Each line painted a portrait more unshakable than the last. One letter came from Colonel Elias Roden, a former Valkyrie unit commander. The clerk read it aloud. If this man raised his voice, the mission was already too far gone. That line lingered in the chamber long after the clerk sat down. Brent's defense attempted one final push. Officer Korr was under stress. The environment was high pressure. He misjudged. But the tribunal was unmoved. The facts, footage, and falsified records outweighed the plea, and Dorian's testimony, measured, principled, unwavering, left no room for doubt. As the tribunal recessed for the day, reporters gathered in hushed clumps just outside the chamber doors. One whispered to another. They came for a hearing. They got a master class. Inside, Dorian stood, blanket folded once more in his arm, his son lightly sleeping against his chest. He said nothing as he exited, but every eye in the room followed him. Because in that moment, no ruling had yet been made, but everyone understood who had already set the standard. And the quote that would later define the day was already etched in the transcripts. If this man raised his voice, the mission was already too far gone. The offer came not in a letter or a public announcement, but through a quiet meeting in a nondescript federal building, 2 blocks from the Aviation Oversight Council. Dorian sat at the far end of a polished oak table, his suit pressed, expression unreadable. Across from him sat Malcolm Dre, a senior administrator with the Aviation Ethics Committee, silver-haired and sharply spoken, flanked by two younger aides who barely looked up from their laptops. A large binder rested between them. Its label read, Protocol Initiative, Dependent Passenger Conduct. Dre spoke first. Major Rell, let me begin by saying that we failed you, but we want to learn from it, and we want your help to make sure it doesn't happen again. Dorian's jaw tightened slightly. He'd heard apologies before. Most came when someone's job was on the line. This one didn't feel rehearsed. Still, he didn't respond. We're proposing a new federal training module, Dre continued, adjusting his glasses. Mandatory across all high-volume transit terminals. It would address not just use of force parameters, but the correct protocols for engaging passengers with dependents, especially those in protected classes. Dorian's eyes narrowed. You want to use my name? Dre didn't flinch. We'd like the initiative to be built with your input. Yes, it would carry your name. We're not here for branding. We're here for credibility. There was a silence that felt like a held breath, the hum of the ventilation above, the slight creak of Dorian leaning back in his chair. I didn't come here to be a poster, he said finally, his voice low, deliberate. We understand, Dre nodded, but you already are, whether you intended to be or not. The footage, the trial, your conduct, it's been studied in academies, shown in symposiums. People are listening. Dorian glanced at the binder. His thoughts weren't on policy. They were on his son. What kind of world he'd inherit? How many fathers might one day be spared a moment like the one he had survived? He exhaled slowly. I'll agree, he said, lifting his gaze to meet Dre's, but on one condition. Name it, Dre replied immediately, almost too eagerly. There needs to be a written clause, clear and uncompromising. No officer may approach a passenger visibly holding a dependent unless there is immediate, demonstrable danger. Not suspected tension. Not non-compliance. Visible danger. Anything less should trigger verbal engagement only. No physical approach. The aides looked up. Dre nodded solemnly. Done. From that moment, the wheels turned fast. The module draft was circulated within weeks. It was called the Rell Protocol, though Dorian insisted it appear in full form as the Dorian-Rell Dependent Passenger Protocol on all legal and training documents. Simulation labs were commissioned. Role-play scenarios were constructed, with emphasis on emotional restraint, verbal de-escalation, and bias interruption. Instructors were rotated out if they failed to meet empathy benchmarks. The module wasn't just about rules, it was about reprogramming judgment. Meanwhile, Brent Korr's career disintegrated in silence. The tribunal ruling had suspended him without pension, citing both misconduct and obstruction. No public ceremony, no honorable departure. Just a plain envelope, delivered by courier with a formal letter of dismissal. But Brent didn't fade quietly. Word surfaced that he had joined an underground legal group, a fringe organization known for targeting federal ethics boards under claims of reverse discrimination. They began posting clips online, heavily edited ones, spinning Brent as the victim, painting Dorian as a manipulative elite who'd used a baby to dodge compliance. The strategy backfired. Within hours, national outlets aired the full, unedited footage side by side with the doctored versions. Side-by-side screens showed Brent's aggression, Dorian's restraint, and the raw moment when the baby's cry had pierced the terminal. The public wasn't fooled. Hashtags flooded every platform. Civil rights organizations condemned the campaign. Even parenting forums picked up the story. A retired general, once silent during the tribunal, broke his silence on a morning broadcast. You assaulted a Tier 1 father carrying a baby, the general said, leaning into the mic. In my book, that's not just unfit for duty, that's unfit for decency. The clip went viral. When Dorian's attorney forwarded the video to him, Dorian simply watched it once, expression unreadable. He didn't comment, didn't share it, But when asked later by a journalist what he thought of the general's words, he gave only a soft nod and said, "We don't train to become heroes. We train so no one else has to be." 3 months after the Varnell terminal incident, the first simulation room at Varnell International Airport flickered to life. Fluorescent ceiling lights buzzed softly overhead. A low murmur filled the room as 5 uniformed officers sat facing a projection screen. A holographic display showed a mock terminal with a man holding a baby in a cloth sling. The simulation's voiceover said, "Observe the body language. Do not initiate contact unless imminent threat is identified." At the center of the room, Officer Halden sat motionless, his jaw clenched. He had volunteered to take the first run through the new Dorian-Rel protocol module. As the scenario progressed, the simulated man gently shifted the child's blanket and attempted to pass through a faulty boarding scanner. The screen flickered red. "Checkpoint failure," the AI narrator stated. "You may proceed with engagement or escalate to supervisory override." Halden paused, recalling the real moment months earlier when Brent had stepped forward instead of stepping back. Halden raised his hand in the simulation and said, "Requesting supervisor override. No immediate threat. Passenger has a dependent in arms." The screen froze. The simulation ended with a simple word across the center: "Success." The room was silent until one of the training supervisors, an older man with graying hair, nodded with quiet approval. "Protocol passed. Level 1 certification granted." Word spread quickly through the ranks. What once was seen as hesitation was now framed as strength. The new training didn't rely on force, it rewarded judgment. Across 5 major airports, from the wide arches of Garrison International to the compact terminals of Norwell Field, similar training modules began reshaping officer reflexes. But not everyone accepted the shift with grace. Brent Korr's name hadn't left the news entirely. Whispers floated through security circles that he'd begun consulting with a fringe legal group specializing in filing ethics pushbacks. Though publicly disgraced, he moved through the shadows of forums and niche broadcasts, arguing he was the real victim. But the tide had turned. Back in his modest apartment just outside Grey Ridge City, Dorian adjusted the grip on his infant son, who was now learning to crawl. The baby's hands slapped the polished wood floor as he made slow, awkward movements toward a soft blue elephant plush. Dorian watched with quiet patience, resisting the urge to guide. Instead, he simply shifted the furniture subtly to make the path clear. A knock at the door broke the rhythm. Dorian opened it to find a familiar face, Officer Halden. He looked nervous, holding a small manila envelope. "I filed for reassignment last week," Halden said, voice steady but eyes uncertain. "They processed it yesterday. Internal review team, ethics branch." Dorian studied him, sensing the weight behind the words. "That's a big shift." Halden nodded. "I realized I can't sit in silence anymore. Not after that day. Not after watching you stay calm with a child in your arms while the rest of us watched." Dorian stepped aside and gestured toward a chair. "You're welcome here, but you didn't come just to tell me that." Halden exhaled, shoulders relaxing slightly. "They want me to give a testimonial. Not against Brent. For you. For the new training. I'm ready. I think others are too." Dorian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced down at his son, who had managed to tip the plush elephant onto its side and was now smiling proudly at no one in particular. "You're not just filing paperwork," Dorian finally said. "You're choosing the hard silence, the one that speaks louder." Halden smiled faintly. Someone had to start. As days passed, the ripple widened. News began circulating that several junior officers at Varnell and its sister terminals had submitted misconduct reports, some from incidents months old, some freshly documented. One memo from a former baggage screener read, "I didn't speak up when I saw the pattern, but after what Major Rel endured, I realized silence is complicity." Journalists caught wind. Quietly at first, then with growing speed, They traced each submission back to the same point of ignition, the VRNDOR107 tag on the Reform Me Mos. Dorian's name was never on them, but the initials were enough to trace the shift in air, not a storm, but a realignment. Dorian declined every interview request. When a renowned documentary filmmaker offered to dedicate an entire segment to the incident, Dorian replied curtly through email, "Let the policy speak louder than I can." Still, stories found their way into daylight. One article featured a screenshot of the terminal's new de-escalation checklist, with a red arrow pointing to the top line. Do not physically engage a passenger holding a dependent unless threat is visible and imminent. Another paper quoted an anonymous officer who said, "I used to think command was about being heard. Now I know it's about knowing when to listen." One morning, while grabbing coffee at a quiet corner cafe, Dorian sat across from an old friend from his Valkyrie unit. The man stirred his drink, glancing out the window toward the city bustle. "Never thought restraint would change more than a mission ever could," he muttered. Dorian nodded slowly. "It wasn't revenge," he said, setting his cup down, voice soft but resolute. "It was realignment." The first edited clip surfaced on a Tuesday morning, barely 30 seconds long. It showed Brent Korr being shoved aside while standing rigid in front of a boarding gate, and Dorian's back as he turned slightly. No audio, no context, no child visible. The source was a fringe legal group calling itself the Civil Uniform Alliance, who claimed Brent had been smeared in the court of public opinion for doing his job. Within hours, the video was blasted across small corners of the internet, amplified by incendiary headlines. "Security officer silenced for standing firm. Woke overreach destroys veteran cop." It was a last-ditch effort, but it was loud. Dorian saw it while waiting at the checkout line of a grocery store, his son quietly teething on a soft ring in the cart seat. A shopper ahead of him glanced at her phone, then back at him, eyes narrowing. He didn't flinch. He had seen this kind of narrative before. Truth cut into pieces, then reshaped to suit the agenda of those unwilling to change. But what Brent hadn't anticipated, what none of them had, was how much had already changed. By evening, the counter-strike arrived. National broadcasters re-aired the full footage from Varnell Terminal, high definition, uncut, and with synced body cam angles. Alongside it, a new clip played from Dorian's tribunal hearing. The quote was calm, almost whispered. "Discipline is when you could, but don't." That line detonated across platforms. Within days, the words appeared on parenting blogs, veteran support forums, and law enforcement ethics pages. Merchandisers printed the quote on dark gray hoodies with small stenciled baby icons. An influential fatherhood group featured it as their monthly motto. A viral post read, "Teach your sons strength isn't in domination. Teach them what Major Rell said." The phrase was even quoted, word for word, by a state senator during a committee hearing on de-escalation protocols. "Discipline is when you could, but don't." But the backlash against Brent's smear campaign didn't just come from ethics watchdogs or civil rights attorneys. It came from regular people. Late one evening, in the baby aisle of a quiet supermarket, Dorian stood comparing brands of formula. He was dressed plainly, black hoodie, track pants, and a soft canvas carrier strapped across his chest, his son now asleep against his chest. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A man, mid-30s, pushed a cart near him, then hesitated. The man wore a simple flannel shirt, tired eyes, and the look of someone who had seen too many news cycles. "You don't know me," the man began, voice hushed but steady. "But my wife and we saw the video. Everything. The trial. The quote." Dorian didn't turn immediately. He looked down at his son, whose head shifted slightly with a baby's sigh. The man took a breath. "We changed how we speak to our son because of what you did. I used to yell. Not anymore." I pause now. I ask myself, Do I need to win this moment or raise a man? You helped me see the difference. Dorian finally looked at him. The man's face wasn't reverent, just honest, grateful. The silence between them stretched, not awkward, but weighty. Finally, Dorian nodded once, his voice low. Then maybe the hardest part had a purpose after all. Dorian sat in a dimly lit room at the headquarters of the Aviation Oversight Council, his posture straight but his eyes weary. A screen glowed softly in front of him, already cued with the latest training footage. Around the room sat 3 evaluators, policy developers, none of them older than 40, all silent, watching him more than the screen. This wasn't his first invitation, but it was the first he had accepted. Not as a figurehead, not as a symbol, just as someone who understood the weight of restraint. The mock scenario began without fanfare. On screen, an actor playing a uniformed officer stepped forward in a simulated terminal. Approaching slowly, he stopped a few feet from a black man holding a swaddled infant. The officer hesitated. His hand drifted near his belt but didn't touch it. Instead, he spoke. "Sir, can I get a supervisor to assist you?" The actor portraying the father gave a slow nod. No shouting, no tension. The scene faded to black. Silence hung for a beat too long. Dorian didn't look at the others. He kept his eyes on the dark screen and said one word, measured, steady, final. Better. The word seemed to echo. One of the younger council aides scribbled something quickly into a folder. Another leaned forward to ask a question, but caught the quiet gravity in Dorian's face and stopped himself. The council lead, a pale man with thinning hair and a nervous cough, cleared his throat. "We've been adjusting modules based on your earlier input," he said. "This one followed the clause you suggested. No physical engagement unless there's a visible threat." Dorian gave a slow nod. "That clause isn't a suggestion anymore. It's a test of character. You either pass it or you don't belong in uniform." He stood up, adjusting his coat, the fabric silent against the plastic seat back. Nobody tried to stop him. They had all read the file, all seen the footage, all watched what discipline looked like when it could have been rage. Outside, the air was cold with the early touch of winter. The council building sat on the edge of the Capitol perimeter, sterile and pale under the street lamps. Dorian walked with a slow, even pace, his thoughts flicking between the past and the present like a man flipping a well-worn coin. He didn't feel like a hero. Not anymore. Not ever, really. Heroes wore capes in cartoons or died in trenches. He had been trained for silence, for action that didn't require applause. But tonight, the weight felt different. Not heavier, just quieter. At home, the apartment was still. The kind of stillness that only exists when a child is finally asleep. He loosened his tie at the door, draped it over the coat rack, and walked into the nursery. His son lay curled on his side in the crib, a soft rustle of breath rising and falling with a small rhythm. Dorian knelt beside the crib, resting one hand gently on the rail. His thoughts were steady now, settled into something clearer than fatigue. The world hadn't changed overnight, but something had shifted, not because of anger, because of restraint. The buzz of a message cut through the silence. He pulled his phone from his pocket and unlocked it. One line lit the screen. New compliance scores just passed. First full quarter with 0 recorded force incidents involving dependents. He stared at the words for a long moment, then glanced back at his son. His voice was low, nearly a whisper. Not to the child, not to the room, just to the moment. We're not raising our voices anymore. We're raising the standard. The new Family Assistance Lounge at Varnell International opened quietly on a gray Monday morning. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no media fanfare, just the low hum of airport traffic and the rustle of stroller wheels across freshly waxed tile. A janitor, an older man named Willis, pushed open the doors at 6:45 a.m. and wiped down the glass benches, unaware he was preparing a space born from protest, pain, and principle. The lounge was tucked between gates 19 and 20, just past where the confrontation had taken place a year ago. But now the area had been softened. Warm lighting, sound-dampening walls, nursing chairs, a toddler play space, and even noise-canceling headsets for overstimulated children. The scent of lavender infused the air, subtle and calming. Travelers passed by it, glancing inside curiously. Most didn't know its origin. Mounted near the entrance was a plaque made of brushed steel. It bore no name, just a single etched line. Discipline is when you could, but don't. Some passers-by paused, puzzled. Others smiled faintly, as if the words struck something deep. One young father, holding his sleeping infant in a sling, adjusted the baby's blanket, looked at the inscription again, and whispered, "Yeah, that's real." Elsewhere, far from the airport's hum, Dorian Rell sat quietly in his living room, his son now toddling unsteadily across the rug. The child's hands gripped the edge of the coffee table as if it were a mountaintop. Each step was cautious but determined. Dorian knelt beside him, not correcting, not rushing, just watching. The television played in the background, muted. A news ticker scrolled across the bottom. New Terminal Lounge opens at Varnell, designed for travelers with young children. But Dorian didn't look up. His attention was on the boy in front of him. When the toddler stumbled, Dorian's hand moved quickly but didn't catch. It hovered, just close enough to steady if needed. The child found his balance on his own. Dorian smiled softly. Later that evening, he received a call from a documentary producer named Ellis Tarrin, a soft-spoken man whose voice carried the weight of someone who had listened more than he had spoken. "Mr. Rell," Ellis began, "we've just finished the final cut. It's done. If you'd like to review the last sequence—" "I trust you," Dorian interrupted. There was no edge in his tone, just closure. "I won't need to see it." Ellis hesitated. "There's something you said during our interview. We're thinking of ending the film on it, but I wanted to ask your permission." Dorian stood by the window, watching dusk settle over the city. Lights flickered on across the skyline like fireflies. "Which part?" he asked. Ellis cleared his throat. "You said, 'Some people think power is what you do to others. I've learned it's what you choose not to do.'" There was a silence. Then Dorian replied, his voice quiet but resolute, "Keep it." And he hung up. That would be the last time Dorian Rell ever spoke publicly about the incident. He received no awards, gave no speeches, and declined every follow-up appearance. He never returned to Varnell International, not even when invited to tour the new lounge. When asked by a friend why, he answered simply, "It's not about seeing what changed, it's about knowing I didn't have to force it." The world, it seemed, had already made room for the echo. The boy, now walking stronger each day, would never know the full story, not yet, but he would feel it, in how his father knelt instead of commanded, in how he listened more than corrected, and in how every boundary his small hands touched came with presence, not pressure. On a quiet night as the toddler fell asleep, Dorian watched him from the doorway. He didn't feel like a hero. He still didn't, but he felt anchored, resolved, the kind of strength that didn't need a uniform to validate it. In the closing moments of the documentary, the screen faded to black, and Dorian's final recorded words echoed in stillness. "Some people think power is what you do to others. I've learned it's what you choose not to do." Seconds later, the Delta Force father moved with precision the crowd couldn't even track. The officer was disarmed, the terminal froze, and the truth hit harder than any blow thrown. If you believe real authority protects the innocent with professionalism, skill, and unstoppable force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores abuse of authority, prejudice, and the moment courage and experience confront arrogance. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and standing up for justice in every situation.